Hey, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two to let folks sign on and make their way into the webinar. So just bear with us for a couple of minutes and then we'll dive right in. I'm still seeing the attendees number go up, so we're going to keep holding for just a minute and let more folks sign on. Right, still seeing people joining, so I'm going to wait till the clock turns to 3:03 and then we'll jump in. All right, I think we should be good to go. I'm sure more people will join. So just want to thank everyone who has had a chance to join so far. I'm Matthew Doherty. I'm an independent consultant who's been working on the framework for an equitable homelessness response project for the last few years. And I'm really also happy to be a part of the Reimagining Interim Housing project. And you have the primary team here today on the call to do the webinar with you all. And if you want to identify yourselves in the chat box, please feel free to go ahead and do that. That would be great. This is the second webinar that we've offered on this topic. I'm hoping that some of you had a chance to join the first webinar back in March, but if not, don't worry too much about it. We'll point you to where you can find the materials from that webinar. We're not going to give as much background information today so that we can dive a little bit more deeply into some of the content than we did on the first webinar. So again, there's lots of tools and resources that can help give you the background information and some of the context that we're going to move through relatively quickly today so that we can get a little deeper into some of the specific tools and guidance and ideas that we're pursuing through the Reimagining Interim Housing project. And I just also want to acknowledge on the front end that even with a 90-minute webinar, we don't have time to go into everything that is captured in the publications and the materials that we've generated so far. So we're going to dive especially deeply into a couple of the action areas that we're suggesting, but we'll go much more quickly through some of the other ones and really encourage folks to spend time with the tools and materials that are available on the website. And we'll point you towards where all of that is available for you. And we want to make sure that we have time for questions. So we're hoping to break for questions at about the midpoint for about 10 minutes, and then have another 15 or 20 minutes for questions at the end. So if you see us moving through content pretty quickly, some of that is because we want to make sure we have time for questions. Next slide, please. So I am really excited to be doing this webinar with my primary partners on this project and in this work, and I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves. So Shaundell, why don't you go first?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Shaundell Diaz. I go by she, her, hers, and I am a person with lived experience, Latina, and the 3-county continuum of care coordinator, entry coordinator. Thank you.
Great, and I'll go to Rashema next.
Awesome. Thank you, Matthew. Hi, everybody. My name is Rashema Melson. I use she, her pronouns, identify as Black. I'm also a person who identifies with having lived experience, and thank everyone for being here today.
Great, and Claudine.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Claudine Sipili. I work at Destination Home as the Director of Lived Experience and Innovation. I also sit on our county COC governance board, and I'm very glad to be here with you all today.
Great, and we've tried to divvy up the content today, so I hope you're going to hear everybody's voices pretty regularly throughout today's webinar. Next slide, please. This is what we're going to try to cover today. We're going to give you a quick overview of the project and process, and we will dive into the input that we receive from people with lived expertise to help inform the project. Quick overview of the project publications that are available for your use. And then we're going to try to spend a good amount of time really talking through the transformation stages that we've identified and are suggesting, and the action areas to help you organize different kinds of work to pursue this kind of transformation. And then we'll take a deep dive into the first stage in action area 1, which focuses on starting to identify the values and standards that you're trying to pursue. We'll break then for questions and answers. We'll then do a deeper dive into the second stage, and it's action area 2, focusing on innovation. And then we'll do much more of a quick review of the 4 other action areas, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then hopefully, again, have time for questions and answers at the end. A couple of logistics things on the front end here. Next slide, please. You can find information about the framework project as a whole at the website housingequityframework.org. And the Reimagining Interim housing materials and the previous webinar, which was in March, are available at the link on the site. And I think Kim from the coalition is going to put these links into the chat box as well. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will also be posted. And we're putting a temporary link to where you can find the slides for today's session into the chat box as well. We know some people like to follow along with the slides on your own, so you should be able to access those if you want to. And again, we're going to break for questions. I'm going to actually strongly encourage you to look for the Q&A part of the icon across the bottom of your screen and put your questions into the Q&A section. It's going to be hard for us to keep track of questions that are in the chat box. So if your first instinct is go to the chat box, we're going to ask you to look a little more closely and look for the Q&A icon and put your question there. And we'll try to get to many of the questions as we can. I also really want to thank the coalition for hosting the webinar today, and especially Kim Johnson for all of her support in our preparations and helping run the webinar with us today. And then I'm going to turn it to Claudine, who's going to try to help us get in the right headspace for focusing on these ideas and concepts.
Thank you, Matthew. So I don't know about all of you, but I'm pretty nervous. So I think this, extremely nervous. So I think this slide is probably more for me, and I apologize if that sounds very selfish. So I would like to invite each of you to, let me find my slide here, to clear your mind as we start on this webinar. I would like to invite you to look away from the challenges, the struggles, the hard work that we all know you're engaged with day in and day out, and just be with us here now in this moment. If you have thoughts that are bombarding your mind, as they are mine right now, maybe jot it down on a Post-it note or put it into the chat box to parking lot them. And be present with us now. Think about some of the changes that you would like to be accomplishing in your communities, and how you would like to specifically transform approaches to sheltering people within your communities. Thank you, and welcome again. Go ahead, Matthew. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Claudine. Next slide, please. So just very quick background, the framework for an equitable Homelessness Response Project is the overarching project, and this Reimagining Interim Housing Project is part of that larger project. Next slide, please. The framework project itself got started very early in the COVID-19 pandemic and has always featured an expansive and very impressive array of partners working together, first to try to provide guidance on how to respond effectively and equitably to the pandemic itself, and then how to use federal resources and other resources that we're pouring into communities in response, and to try to drive progress on homelessness, but also progress towards equity and justice, and now is working on a variety of other activities to try to advance the work of addressing homelessness in ways that embrace and drive progress towards equity and justice. Next slide, please. This Reimagining Interim Housing Project got started in, I think, late 21, and we'll talk a little bit about the process. We came to this work with some perspectives that were reinforced through the early explorations. First, that we've neglected to focus on adequately supporting and guiding the implementation of high quality programs when it comes to interim housing, emergency shelter, other kinds of temporary accommodations. It's a part of our systems that we have neglected and not focused on what would it take to do that work as well as we could do. And so we wanted to wrestle with that, but also a recognition that just making adaptations within current programs and kind of playing around the edges and tweaking policies and practices, that would not be fully responsive to the guidance and recommendations that were being provided by people with lived expertise and people who have recently experienced interim housing and emergency shelter programs. And something more fundamental needed to happen and needed to be changed in order to be responsive to that guidance and those recommendations. Next slide, please. So our objective was to try to create tools that communities could use to envision and pursue transformation of their approaches. So very much trying to think about what would it take to create change? How could we pursue change in a really thoughtful and purposeful way, and a way that embraced the expertise of people who lived experience, a way that centered and led with a focus on equity and justice, and how do we pursue transformation? So that's what we've tried to wrestle with, rather than specific guidance about how to operate specific kinds of programs. What we're going to talk about today and the publications that we've created are much more about what does it take to pursue transformation, and how do we start building momentum towards transformation. Next slide, please. So the process of getting to where we are today featured focus groups with people with lived expertise. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. And we also did interviews with leaders from homelessness response systems, from provider organizations and national organizations. And then we also held some small group discussions to help us flesh out our ideas and the ideas and what we would put in the materials, and how did we envision and suggest pursuing transformation. Next slide, please. So we're going to pause along the way here, and my three co-presenters are going to have a bit of a dialogue among themselves several times here. And first, we thought it would be helpful if they each talk to why they wanted to be a part of this project and why they think this transformation work is so important. So I'll turn to whoever wants to go first on that question.
I can jump in first, Matthew.
Right.
So as a human who has trudged through a period of homelessness in my life, periods of housing instability, and then also the fallout that came from those experiences, it took me a long time to realize that I no longer had to be ashamed of that time in my life, of my history. With the support and encouragement of the compassionate leaders in our housing and homelessness sector here in Santa Clara County, California, I came to understand that I really could help change the system from the inside out by providing my perspectives and putting my heart into my work. I could use my firsthand experiences to transform the way our system approaches sheltering and housing the most vulnerable human beings, just like you and me, that are still trudging through homelessness. So when the opportunity came up to be a part of this national framework project, I didn't hesitate to jump in. Transformation as everyone knows, is not an easy thing, right? As in the case of metamorphosis, it requires a dramatic change from the inside out. And that's why I wanted to be a part of this project, because the difficult work in front of us requires all of us. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
I can go next. Thank you so much for that, Claudine. That made me pull from why I wanted to be a part of this. And I lived in a shelter for a few years with my family as a teenager. And on some nights, I would prefer to be somewhere else dealing with people who were experiencing drug substance abuse and being around that environment, to go spend a night somewhere else just to get out of that environment. And so I feel like this transformation is so important, and I really, really want to be a part of it, because I want other people to be able to want to receive the services and not push away from them. And so I feel like if we make this environment a place where people will want to come get the services, then we can do the goal that we set out to do, which is overall, of course, is to reduce and end homelessness. And first we got to start with like the interim housing, in which are commonly known as shelters, and we're trying to fix that language. But I want it to be a place where people feel comfortable. So that's why I wanted to do this, and I'm doing it with some really, really awesome people. And I'll pass it to Shaundell.
Thank you, Rashema. Thank you, Claudine. Myself being a person who also went through the homeless system here in Western Massachusetts, I felt that it's just super important. I too am in a position right now of power, where I can not only incorporate the voices of people experiencing or that have experienced homelessness and that have gone through our systems into this change, and making sure that their voices are heard. You know, I didn't become homeless because of substance abuse, mental health, or because I was uneducated. You know, I just became homeless because I went through some really rough times, and I wasn't homeless alone. I was with my 4 children, and not having the supports that I needed. I know that it was important, especially now that I can be that voice and incorporate that voice of others into this work, that this framework be a key aspect and a priority within our community. Because let's just be honest, us as a community, as the folks that have come into the homeless world, advocacy world, we have to do better. We have to make changes at a systemic level so that there is help in making these connections for those that are going through our systems. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. Now we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into what we heard from people with lived expertise through focus groups. So next slide, please. The National Coalition for the Homeless has been a key partner on this project as well. And in the first half of 2022, they conducted 7 listening sessions on behalf of the project that had 33 total participants, geographically diverse in many other ways, and 84% of the people who participated in those focus groups were people of color. And we're going to highlight some of the key feedback that we heard through those focus groups in the next several slides. But one of the overarching things that we heard consistently was there needed to be more of asking people what they needed, what they value, what they want, what are their expectations, what's going to be helpful to them, and that as a system, we haven't always prioritized that dialogue. And so we're really trying to make sure we listen closely to and bring forward the voices of folks with lived expertise. And on the next several slides, you'll see quotes that came directly from focus group participants. But we're going to dive into some of the key themes. And Rashema, I'm going to go to you first. And on the next slide, please, to talk about some of the feedback we heard.
Awesome. Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, so if everyone will look at the quotes, you'll see that they are referenced around the cleanliness and even the safetyness of people being in these environments. And some of the things that are super important is that people don't think too much about the cleanliness of the environment that we are helping to house people in, because the goal is just to get them in there, but we don't think about there's mold in between the cracks of the towels. Is the water hot, or does the water just work? Does the toilet, is it clean or does it just flush? And so even if you look at the inspection standards for what does it mean and what's the guidelines around that, it just says as long as it's working, it's not more concerned with the actual condition, and everybody deserves to live in a clean environment. So I noticed from the focus group answers, that's a lot of people talked about that. And even in my own experience, a lot of that was taking place where it wasn't the cleanliness environment. Also regarding safety, the presence of police officers is very triggering, especially to people of color. So just being mindful to think about what type of security and safety measurements you want to put in place. And if they're there to make sure that they're actually doing their job. I've seen a lot of things happen where you have security in place and nobody does anything if something happens. Let's not pay people and use funds towards that if they're not going to actually make sure that the people who are staying in these environments are really safe. We don't want to waste funds, and we want to maximize all our efforts in the best way possible. Next slide, please. Awesome, thank you. So if you look here, it's around the thoughts about how the facilities are set up. What are we doing with the different rooms in the facilities? We don't want to create an environment that seems similar to a prison where people are trapped or people have limited options. We want people to feel comfortable in the spaces that they're staying in. So that means even if there's a guarding room, even if there's a library, we have children in these places, right? So setting up a place that they feel comfortable with playing in and making sure that they, of course, we talked about security again, are safe again. We have known for things to take place in shelters where children have went missing or things have happened and people were not paying close attention. So if that means playrooms and having people there to be able to watch them, just being super mindful of every single part of this, because these are people's homes. They're not permanent homes, but when I lived in the shelter, that was the only place I had to call home. That's where I would have hoped to receive mail. I couldn't bring friends there, but we have to think of it the same way of if we were living there, what kind of spaces and destinations do we want in our home to feel comfortable when we're relaxing and resting and when we come there. Next slide.
Yes, so people also expressed mixed experiences with non-congregate and hotel-based shelters. As you can see on the slide, we have direct quotes from the focus groups. Respondents who had stayed in a hotel-based program expressed many positives, things like having privacy and having a shower and access to a refrigerator, having a locked door, and also an opportunity to meet with case managers to help them with the things that they need most. The ability to isolate during that COVID-19 time. And then also, I think more importantly, this greater sense of community and safety, as well as a positive impact on the self-esteem of the people that were in these hotel-based programs. People also identified things that didn't work well within hotel-based programs, such as having to share a room with an individual you didn't even know, a complete stranger. The absence of staff and the difficulty of coordinating with staff in some programs. There were also experiences with police raids, as Rashema shared a little bit earlier in one program, and the fact that many people were returned to homelessness as funding for hotel-based programs dried up and ended. Most, but not definitely all participants leaned heavily towards permanent housing options as the place where most resources should be targeted. Although all respondents thought that interim housing should still be a part of the funding mix. And there was also strong support for dedication, time, and effort and resources to strengthening approaches to sheltering people. Next slide.
And if you can see, if you would take a moment to read the comments on this slide from our focus groups, this showed importance of services, staffing, and how people are treated. Participants shared that ensuring adequacy and quality of services and welcoming and respectful treatment of clients is essential within all models and settings, including by expanding peer support positions, supporting and developing the skills of staff, ensuring high quality communication and treatment of clients, providing access to health services, and supporting clients' ability to use their time productively. But access to resources to support exits to housing is also essential to ensure strong outcomes for programs, not only making sure that we provide those resources and connections while folks are in interim housing, but making sure that those same services follow them through their permanent supportive housing or permanent housing journey. There was also recognition of the importance of implementing person-centered changes to design and environments within existing settings, including congregate settings, to better achieve intended values, qualities, especially changes that can reduce trauma, enhanced privacy, and support people's dignity. Next slide.
Great, thank you all. And for folks who want to dive a little bit more deeply into the feedback and input and recommendations we received, if you go to the publications themselves, there's a little more detail around the input from the focus groups, from the interviews with leaders from different parts of the system. And so just strongly encourage you to dive into that content as well. Next slide, please. On the last webinar and in the documents themselves, we explore some of the language choices that we're making. We're not going to go through all of that again today, but we do want to talk about the use of the term interim housing within this project and why we've chosen that language. And I'm going to turn it to Rashema to talk us through that. And I'm sorry, Shaundell to talk us through that. So next slide, please.
It's like, wait a minute. No. Thank you, Matthew. So we have purposefully chosen to entitle this project and this document Reimagining Interim Housing, but want to make sure that the meaning and intentions behind the term interim housing are clear. We have received considerable guidance from people with lived expertise and experiences of homelessness about the stigmatizing and traumatizing impacts of language in current usage within homeless response systems, including the term emergency shelter. Based upon that guidance, we have chosen to largely avoid the term emergency shelter within this document. Instead, we have chosen to refer to interim housing, or less frequently to sheltering people. The term interim housing is not meant to refer to one specific program model. Rather, the term is meant to refer to a full range of shorter-term crisis options for temporary accommodations, which may currently be referred to by a variety of terms: congregate or non-congregate emergency shelter, navigation centers, bridge housing, transitional housing, or other models or terms. The term interim housing is also not meant to imply that people who are staying in such programs have ended their experiences of homelessness. People in interim housing programs of any type are still experiencing homelessness, and interim housing programs alone cannot end homelessness within our communities. We recognize that it will take time to shift language usage consistently, and that language will likely continue to evolve as we strive to reimagine and transform our approaches. We also know that some programs may have to use specific terms for their programs or models based upon funding sources, eligibility requirements, regulations, or for other reasons. In implementing transformation efforts, we encourage people to use the term that makes the most sense locally, while also listening to and following the guidance and preferences of the people with lived expertise within your community. Next slide. This document specifically focuses on transforming approaches to interim housing, an essential but often neglected or undervalued component of homeless response systems, a component that must be strengthened both to better meet the crisis needs of people experiencing homeless and to create better, more effective pathways to permanent housing for many people. This focus, however, should not be interpreted as a belief that transforming interim housing alone can end homelessness in our communities. Within this focus on transforming interim housing options, we recognize that all of the following are true. Ending homelessness will require vastly increasing affordable housing options enriched with tailored levels of supportive and health services to address people's needs and goals. Interim housing models must be implemented that will provide more accessible, welcoming, dignified, and healthy options for people in crisis and will better facilitate people's access to permanent housing. The full success and impact of interim housing programs however, will remain dependent on the scale and range of affordable housing and services options within communities, and that the scale of interim housing options needed will vary over time based upon the availability of permanent housing options. People's access to permanent housing options should not be dependent upon their agreement to enter interim housing programs, and communities should also strive to strengthen their capacity to connect with people who are unsheltered directly to permanent housing. Next slide. And I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to ask Claudine and Rashema to respond. Why is it important for communities to focus on interim housing while also striving to expand permanent housing solutions?
Yeah, thank you, Shaundell. I can jump in first on this one, Rashema. So I really think, this being the second webinar that we've done on the framework project, I really feel like we continue to preach to the choir, right? So in many communities across the country, and probably your communities, there's just not enough deeply affordable permanent housing or even permanent supportive housing units available for unhoused people to move into. Interim housing provides a temporary place for people to get into, out of the elements, into a service-enriched environment where they have the dignity of privacy, having a locked door, having access to essential needs like a hot meal, a shower, using the restroom, and where they can start to work with case managers to pave out a path for them towards permanent housing. And with that being said, I also want to re-emphasize some critical key points that you may have already heard from the first webinar, or maybe even have seen in the documents itself. Number one being, people living in interim housing sites are still experiencing homelessness, right? So building up your interim housing sites in your communities is not going to permanently solve homelessness. Number two, interim housing sites alone cannot end homelessness within our communities. Number three, and lastly, the success and impact of interim housing will remain completely dependent on the availability of affordable and accessible housing. Thank you.
Yeah, Claudine, I think you touched on everything. And I just want to emphasize from something that I said earlier, also by going through this step with interim housing, you're building that trust with communities and people who experience homelessness, and understanding that for someone who is experiencing homelessness, let's eliminate all the stigmas that comes along with that. It's just a person who's going through a hard time, or a family who's going through a hard time. And what that means is that anyone could go through that. And so the more that people trust the system and understand that we are here to help, then the better we'll actually be able to prioritize people and to get them into permanent housing options once they're available. So I think that's super important, the trust aspect of it. And if we can do that through this first preliminary stage of interim housing, then I think we can go further with helping people. Next slide, please.
Great, thank you all. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes trying to do a very quick review of the materials that the project has generated so far. We released 2 publications in December of 2022. We'll put the link to where you can find those into the chat box a few times already, I think. Next slide, please. And we primarily, one slide back, please. There we go. So our fundamental objective was try to help think through what would it take to implement a way to transform how we shelter people in our communities. So the primary document focuses on the content we're going to cover today, but we also know that programs need to strengthen their practices right now. So we also took time to take a pass through, trying to find all the good examples of tools and materials and guidance that could help strengthen current programs right now. And we issued that as a supplement that people can use to strengthen what you're doing day to day, while you also think through how as a community could we pursue transformation. Next slide, please. So in the supplement, we again cast a pretty wide net and looked for as many tools and resources we could find, organized them into a set of topic areas to help make it easy for people to think through, what am I trying to work on? What do I want to improve? How can I find in this document what I'm looking for? So you see the topics on the screen. But I will say this is a neglected area within our homelessness response systems. And so one of the things we also did was identify where there were major gaps and where there just wasn't enough information and content to help people strengthen their current programs. And we hope that over time we'll continue to identify more materials and be able to expand this document. Next slide, please. So the fundamental document that we're going to talk about the most today is the Reimagining Interim Housing and the stages and the action areas. What we really want people to receive this document is as a guiding roadmap that you can seek to follow and implement, and that you can use to then apply your own creativity and customize the approaches to best fit your community. We don't want it to be received as we're dictating these specific steps have to happen in this way in every place. And we're not expecting that communities are going to be able to follow each and every element of the guidance within the documents. We're really trying to express a vision that people can hopefully be inspired by and think about how to apply it to your own community, your own work. And it does not answer every question we know. We don't have proven best practices for this kind of transformation to point to yet. But we do intend to dive further into helping support communities to implement elements of this roadmap, and hopefully over time can start to answer more questions and start to point to strong examples. Next slide, please. And then we also just want to be explicit that we know there are things that the document does not do. It does not provide day-to-day operations and services guidance for interim housing providers. That wasn't our objective. Again, it doesn't prescribe specific steps, but hopefully that feels freeing rather than restricting. It doesn't identify examples of communities who have implemented this roadmap yet, but we hope over time. And then we know this might be a bit of a deal breaker for folks and like a non-starter, but we don't know what specific funding sources are going to help support this transformation activities. But we still think it's important that we get to clarity about what it is we want to be doing and how we want to get there, and not be restricted by only whether there's money available to do that yet. So we know that that's a challenge that's going to be a major obstacle for this work. It was not something that we could solve for every community here, but we do hope that people can still find ways to move forward and then start to generate solutions around funding. Next slide, please. So now we're going to start to dive into the actual transformation stages and action areas that the documents detail. And we've organized that into 3 stages and 6 action areas. And next slide, please. And a few notes of caution here as well is, even though the content on the following slides is abridged from the document, we know it's still dense, but we hope that we're giving you access to information in a variety of ways, and over time you can start to absorb more of it. We're going to walk through each of the stages in the action areas, but we're going to dive most deeply into the first 2, which are pretty foundational for any of the work that follows. And again, we're going to try to pause for questions once in a little bit, and then again at the end of the webinar. But if you really want to see the full content, you do have to go to the documents themselves. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it to Claudine.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. So this staged approach that Matthew just covered and the implementation of these action areas can help ensure that, first of all, a clear and compelling vision is developed and communicated for the planned transformation of approaches, and for the provision of stronger, more welcoming, empathetic, and effective interim housing options to people experiencing homelessness, and options that help support their ability to end their homelessness by accessing permanent housing. Then, grounded in that vision, multiple transformation and improvement efforts are pursued concurrently, with areas of focus being identified based upon your local considerations and priorities and opportunities. Finally, these transformation efforts will require a sustained dedication of time, effort, and resources. Like we've said early on in this presentation, transformation is not easy at all. It's probably going to get a lot more difficult before it becomes easier. So shifting to the most successful and sustainable models across the homelessness response system, and then building on that momentum that will be necessary to achieve the full scale and ongoing transformation that Matthew spoke about earlier. And throughout all of the efforts and activities, there has to be a sustained and leading focus on racial justice and equity, and on seeking and following the guidance of people with lived experience and expertise, and also the people that work in direct service roles. It's expected that transformation will require repeatedly cycling through the stages and the action areas that you will see on this webinar and also in the documents over an extended period of time. If you haven't done so, if you have bought into this framework, print a copy, send it to FedEx, and have it at your desk, because this information is so critical to the work that you are either already embarking on or hoping to embark on. Next slide. Oh, okay. So as you have seen in the framework, within each stage are the different action areas, the objectives, some priorities for partnering with people with lived experience and expertise, providing some guidance and considerations for advancing toward equity and justice, implementation recommendations, and then also the tools and resources that can help support activities. Next slide, please. And here are the action areas from the three stages that you are seeing on your screen. So identifying the values and standards. I fully and firmly believe in value-based approaches, and establishing those values ahead of time are in my opinion, are very critical. In action area 2, adding new models and programs into homelessness response system and assess impact, right? So there's a huge burden on all of your systems right now. I'm thinking I feel like every time a pit count report comes out, it provides this burden and stress on everyone trying to figure out where the funding would be coming from, all of those things. And so it's important to just keep at the sort of like the growth and operating phases in your systems. The action area 3 here, assessing successes and areas for improvement, and 4, deploying capacity building and quality improvement efforts continually, and then aligning interim housing programs within systemic efforts to end homelessness. So if there's a plan to end homelessness in your community, obviously this would sort of integrate into that. And then adapting improving efforts and initiating shifts to successful models within your systems and communities. Thank you. Next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Claudine. So we know that this vision is really ambitious, and it has to be, right? So they always say shoot for the moon and aim for you'll fall for the stars if you don't make it, right? So we want to shoot as far as possible because people's lives are at stake here, and we want to take this super serious, and we know that this won't happen overnight, right? So it's going to take a few years and maybe even more than a few years, but just know that any progress is progress. So what this means is more dedication and time from your leadership, from your partners. What that means is strengthened coordination across all organizations and systems. We know that the homelessness sector is not just standing alone. It has so many intersectional pieces to it. And to be able to actually help the people that we serve, we have to make sure that we're working together as a team with our partners on this. And most importantly is making sure to partner with people with lived experience, because they are the experts of the issue. So bringing together that lived experience and learned experience, and making sure that also our vision is realistic, right? And the next part of that is laying the groundwork. So that means if we haven't already identified our allies, or if we need to identify additional allies, being sure to take all routes to seek out and identify who they may be and how can we collaborate with them on this effort. Also creating a really high level project plan and letting people with lived experience, when I say partner, really be a partner to that, which means being in control of making those decisions, taking the word power out and adding in ability, so that everybody has the ability to contribute to what we're doing at the moment. And then of course, also making sure that we have access to essential data And also incorporating data storytelling, that's been super helpful. So even when we did the focus groups, having people with lived experience talk about their experience and pulling from that, what can we do to be better at the work that we're already doing regarding interim housing. And then, of course, as mentioned, the essential ingredients of this is making sure that we have people with lived expertise and experience at the table, making sure that we have partners who are willing and able to go the long mile with us, because this will not be an overnight thing. And then also engagement with other community partners, right? So if that means local nonprofits, religious groups, any other partners who you feel can be super, super beneficial to this process, please feel free to include them in, because we're going to need all the help we can to really make sure that this transformation takes place. Next slide, please.
Great, thank you. So we're going to walk through the first stage in a little bit more depth, but now would be a good time to start putting questions into the Q&A box, because after we get through the next several slides, we're going to wrestle with some of those questions. We especially are going to look for questions that focus on effectively partnering with and empowering and supporting people with lived expertise, or related to identifying the values and qualities that should be prioritized within your transformation efforts. So if you can try to think if there's questions along those lines, those are the ones we're going to look for first. Next slide, please. And I'm going to move fairly quickly because the vision for this work is ambitious, and I'm realizing the amount of content we tried to put into the webinar was ambitious as well, and we want to make sure we do have time for questions. So again, the first stage focuses on initiation of this work and establishing the vision for transformation, and really delving into just identifying and describing with clarity the values and the standards that you're trying to embrace within your community's interim housing programs. And some of the key objectives that you might be pursuing at this action area would be collaborative, open planning and engagement process, and striving to achieve that you're trying to bring people to the table and get to some agreement around the values and standards you're striving to achieve. And you really want to make sure that those values and standards reflect and center the current and future needs, interests, and guidance of people with lived expertise and people who are currently experiencing homelessness in your community, and see this as an opportunity to create community support and generate engagement and bring people to the table by the kinds of conversations you're having. Next slide, please. So for each of the action areas within the documents, we identify some explicit examples of how you might partner with people with lived expertise within this part of the work, as well as ways to think about leading with racial justice and equity. And we're just going to highlight a couple of examples here. So in this action area, you might be especially focused on initiating your processes with paid roles for people with lived expertise, and compensating people for other ways that they're consulting and providing guidance into your processes. And here you may also really want to focus on understanding what prevents people from entering current programs, and what would help ensure that those programs are seen as meaningful and useful options to people who are experiencing homelessness. Again, many more examples are in the document themselves, and you can see some of them in gray tone on the slide. As you think about centering racial justice and equity work efforts within this work, here you want to make sure that you're really doing that within all of your discussions, and that you're purposely identifying current values and standards that are operationalized within your programs that are reinforcing inequities, and that you are going to proactively not embrace and not support moving forward. So that takes some really hard looking at how things are currently working and listening to people about what they experience, but recognizing what's actually working at cross purposes to justice and equity, and being willing to move away from those things. Next slide, please. So then the document provides a variety of other kinds of implementation recommendations. Again, we're not expecting that everybody can do every single thing that we identify, but looking to inspire people to think about how to do the work as well as they can. And here, one element of this guidance is that you do really want to engage diverse opinions and perspectives and bring people to the table, but you are not striving for 100% agreement. You are not striving for everybody in your homelessness response system to give you permission to pursue transformation, because you won't get there. But you do need those allies that Rashema talked about to help carry the work forward. And then you really want to make sure that the values and the standards that you identify have been informed by a broad range of perspectives, and then use those to create awareness of the need for transformation and use what you're striving for to help discuss what's not working well within your community's efforts currently. Next slide, please. And just to give you an idea, when we say qualities and values, these are the kinds of words that came up a lot within the focus groups and within the interviews we pursued. And when we asked people what qualities and values should be emphasized, a whole lot of ideas came forward, but these themes really came through most strongly. And so when you think about what it is you're trying to identify, these are the kinds of things that you want to think about. Is how are you embracing anti-racist approaches? How are you housing focused? Are you creating pathways out of shelter? How are you creating cohesiveness across programs? So again, just a list of ideas and themes to help spur thinking about what does your community need to focus on and most prioritize. Next slide, please. So here we're just going to turn to my panelists for a moment. And I think I'm going to Shaundell first. Why do you think it's important to start with and devote enough time to identifying the values and standards to be pursued?
Thanks, Matthew. This is such a great question. In the community that I represent, again, the Western Mass region, which spans over 4 rural counties, some more rural than the others, we felt that it was important to start with identifying what is working, what isn't working, and what we want to change. We felt that this was an important and crucial step because we did not want to feel like we were reinventing the wheel, but enhancing the existing systems and service models currently to focus our attention on key priorities rather than biting off more than we could chew. We even utilized the iceberg model for understanding systems from the Institute of Social Change that is helping our community to identify specific events related to what isn't working, and just making sure that, you know, we're able to focus on what people with lived experience and community members really felt needs to be pursued. Thank you.
Yes, and I'll jump in here to answer the second question on your screen. So if you were knee deep in your community's homelessness response efforts during COVID, you're well aware of how critical it was to act quickly with the limited resources you had available. In crisis modes, it's difficult to focus on values-based work, and we have seen the effects of that in our own community here in Santa Clara County, to where you move so quickly to put something up, and it's a good thing, right, to get people indoors, but then you go back at it and look at it and you go, oh, I see where some of the gaps are. And usually those gaps exist in the form of like quality of service, right? I feel like that's the first thing that goes. And because of that, it sort of reduces the people, the quote unquote people piece of why you're doing this in the first place. So when you lay the foundation from a human-centered perspective and a values-based approach, even in crisis situations, and as you all have seen in your own communities, you continue to walk the line and hopefully not deviate too far off from that center. Next slide. Thank you, Matthew.
Great, thank you. So we're going to turn to some questions now. We're going to spend maybe 7 or 8 minutes on questions now, and then we're hoping again to have more time at the end. Especially going to focus on questions about partnering and empowering and supporting people with lived expertise and values and qualities. And so I've seen a few questions come into the Q&A, and that's where we're going to look for questions there. We've talked a little bit about balancing this work with also pursuing permanent solutions. Shaundell or Claudine, do you have thoughts about also striking the balance between this need for reimagination and the lack of shelter within communities currently and the lack of capacity? And how do you think communities can wrestle with that balance of addressing immediate needs, but also thinking about this kind of reimagination or transformation? Any immediate thoughts on that?
Yeah, sorry, Matthew, I was distracted by one of the questions in the Q&A about tokenization.
That one next.
Yeah, I think specifically about that, I mean, I work in the system, right? I recently went from direct service delivery into systems change, so I don't see too much of the boots to the ground or boots on the ground services being offered. I think, as I stated earlier, there's just so much stress and burden on everything. This seeing people that are unsheltered and seeing their immediate needs and wanting to divert everything, your resources, to help that, to improve the quality of life for people that are unsheltered, but then also having to deal with building your own capacity so that you can long-term sort of improve the services and shift from crisis intervention into this long, hard work of reimagining and then putting some things into place. I definitely think that the leaders that are in organizations and also systems have to, first of all, buy into this idea of not burning out the staff with the immediate needs stuff, even though that's critically important, right? It's saving lives. But also then have those leaders be strategic enough to sort of focus on what do we do now? This is what we're doing in the moment to respond, but how do we think forward and start some things, put some things into place that will help communities and organizations be able to grow and operate at the same time. So that's it for me. Shaundell, do you have any input on that question?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Claudine. I think you really touched, a lot of bases with your answer. And I just want to say that, our COC, community continuum of care, in Western Mass is really spearheading this in our area. And we have convened a work group. That's the first step. Getting people within your homeless systems that are working together as a community to make the change. That's the first step, right? Making sure that like-minded people and maybe not so like-minded people are in and at a decision-making table, especially people with lived experience. And I just see that, the gains that we're making, but and unsimultaneously, we actually set out a diversity survey, which helped one of our shelter providers to ask their staff, what's going on, diversity, what type of trainings do you want? So the equity and inclusion and racial justice part of everything is being asked in that survey. And it's actually helped us to identify some needs within our community. And that's a foundation. That's setting a foundation to listening to people and what they need. So thank you so much.
Great. Then we have a question from an organization seeking to bring people with lived expertise either onto a board or to play more active roles within decision-making. Just thoughts that you have on how to invite people into those roles without it being a token invite, and really empowering people to play those roles well. Thoughts on what helps make for success in those areas?
Can I jump in on this one? And I'm going to be saying our COC because, that's our COC. Our COC, what we found was really helpful was that we created a flyer. Our Equity and Inclusions Committee created a flyer, right? And this is after a 2-year process of creating a racial equity plan, right? Which had an action area of prioritizing people with lived experience. And on that flyer, it doesn't feel, being a person of lived experience, I was able to have input in that and have it not be a tokenizing invite, because I know what it is to be the token Hispanic with lived experience in a predominantly white county. So what I will say is that we got some really good feedback, and I wasn't the only person, by the way, who helped to create that flyer, but just sending out the ask and having it be a conversational piece from advocates. Hey, there's this really great group. We currently have a people with lived experience action board, and paying them for their expertise. That is key. That is the importance, and having varied ways of payment is really super important too. So I hope that answered. Claudine, did you have anything?
Yes, I wanted to add, I actually looked at that question and was excited to provide an answer for it. So I really think with tokenization, I want to congratulate the center, the Interim Housing Center, for the work that you're already doing. I think feedback loops go a long way, right? So when you have a feedback loop in place, it makes it so that you're not just trying to tap into the lived experience or expertise of a person just to take their knowledge and then use it and then never get back to them about any changes that are made in your programs or services or operations based on their feedback, right? So I think open communication, transparency, in when you're inviting people with lived experience to come to the table, to sit at the table, be transparent about what exactly is expected of them, what kind of support you would provide to help them succeed in that capacity. And then number two, provide sort of like a progression of or an outlook of this project or whatever the initiative is that you're pushing that's requiring perspectives or feedback of people with lived experience, and keep them informed, right? The other thing too is look a little deeper than just getting feedback, right? Get them involved in actually making decisions, in designing what? Maybe designing an actual program. Have them come up with whatever the critical components are that would make one of your programs or initiatives successful, and then also involve them in the ongoing stuff, right? Ongoing operations, the types of services that need to be in place, and maybe even the how to provide that service, right? So in what way? All of us like to feel important. All of us like to feel like we matter to other humans. And so that quote unquote how, it can be very important for people most impacted by homelessness to provide insight into how you design that. And going then back to that feedback loop, invite them in. So if utilizing their people with lived experience, their feedback and input resulted in some kind of improvement in your process and your system, in how you provide services, oh my goodness, invite them to come back in and be witnesses to the change and to the improvements that you have made. And as my colleague Shaundell brought up, fairly and equitably compensating people for their time goes a long way, right? Never assume that you're just going to pull them in and they don't need any help. They don't, like transportation to get to the event or whatever it is. Provide that compensation and maybe even reimbursements for people that for people's needs, right? So if someone had to put their child in childcare just to be at your event, to be able to speak as a person with lived experience, reimburse them for that, right? Or paying for a Lyft or an Uber ride for them to get there, and then continue to stay in contact with them. Thank you. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you both. I know there's a couple other questions in the Q&A box. Those will be teed up for when we get back to questions in just a little bit. We're running a few minutes behind on our content, so we might streamline some of the next sections a little bit, but we're going to dive a little further and go into the second stage of this work. So the next slide, please, which focuses on innovation and an area in which you'll pursue multiple ways of transforming your work concurrently, knowing that they all kind of intersect and reinforce each other. So next slide, please. This one has 4 different action areas, and you might not need to be doing all of them all at the same time. There may be ways that you need to dive into most deeply. But some of the essential things that feel like they are necessary for actual transformation to happen is to test new models and programs and assess how they're working. And then to be in action area 3, be really conscious and thoughtful about, are you getting better at achieving the values and standards that you identified as a community that you were pursuing? And then action area 4 is around the capacity building and trying to shore up and strengthen the ability of programs to achieve those values and standards, and not starting with a punitive approach, but starting with the ability to to invest in people's capacity and achieve those standards and values. And then to really be thoughtful about how interim housing fits within your larger response to homelessness. And is it an effective part and connected to the resource it needs to play the roles that you need it to play, so that it can be a part of the lasting solutions for homelessness. Next slide, please. So we're going to delve a little bit more deeply into action area 2, which is around the adding new programs. So here you want to create and test a range of alternative approaches, things that either don't exist or just very small pilots within your system, and that you think have the ability and the promise of providing better services and better achieving the values and standards you're seeking. You want to be very thoughtful about comparing the ease of access and client satisfaction and performance and outcomes of new models and programs to existing programs. So is what you're testing and trying, is it actually demonstrating better results, better experiences for people? What does that look like when you look across issues of race, ethnicity, gender, and gender identity, et cetera? So be very thoughtful that, are you actually making things better? Or have you just tested something that doesn't seem to be making much of a difference? And then being transparent and rapidly reporting what you're finding so that the community, I think Claudine just talked about a feedback loop of one example, but I think this is another place where feedback and transparency is really important for knowing that you're trying something different and that people can trust you're going to be accountable and honest about what happened and what was achieved and what worked and what didn't work. Next slide, please. In the interest of time, I'm not going to dive into these next couple of slides just so that we can move forward. But again, for each of these action areas, we identify some very specific ways that you can partner with people who lived expertise in this part of the work, and the very specific ways that you can lead with a focus on justice and equity in this specific element of your work. Next slide, please. And other kinds of implementation recommendations that you should be thinking about during this action area, and just a sort of a checklist of things to think about. And are those ways that you can strengthen your work and that you can advance transformation in your community? But the general theme here is innovation, being open to trying new things, and learning and being honest about what you're learning. So next slide, please. So Shaundell, Claudine, any thoughts around ways that you think communities can start to put these ideas and start to put this culture of innovation and trying new things into action?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I'm so cold where I'm sitting. So making me more nervous. So I want to start out with saying that the role that I'm in right now at Destination Home is called Director of Lived Experience and Innovation. To this day, so I've been in this role now for almost a year, and to this day, I'm still figuring out that word innovation that's in my title. And I think, number one, it's an intimidating word. Like, how do you know if something that you put into place is innovative, right? I think one of the most important characteristics of an innovative idea is that it solves a problem, and that the innovation, for it to be true innovation, adds real value to those who use it, right? So thinking along the lines of reimagining approaches to sheltering people. Innovation also requires partnership, right? I really believe that innovation cannot exist without partnership. And along with that partnership is collective impact, right? So partnership with whom? Well, first of all, partnership with people with lived experience. It must start there, or people most impacted by the homelessness services that you provide through your community and your response systems, right? So people with lived experience, as you have heard over and over and over again, they are the ones that understand what it was like facing the challenges, the struggles, the sometimes the bureaucratic processes that people have to move through to be able to get to the other side of whatever their next phase or their next step is. I think it's very important to start with them, right? So if you don't already have a group of people with lived experience in your organization or in your system in your COC, maybe it's time to convene a group, right? And I want to make myself available to that too. If you're on this call and there will be a slide where you'll see my email address. If you need a little bit of help with that, let me know. Send me an email. I can help. I can help with structuring out how to start. So convening a group of people with lived experience to start evaluating your current sheltering and interim housing approaches. Whatever your policies are, what are the things that are not making this work, right? So those are the things that you would want people most impacted by homelessness to look at and make improvements, and get people involved in participating in the thinking up what the key elements should be of a sheltering system, right? Or interim housing, and then also involve them in the design. And then the services and the way, as I said earlier, the way that you provide services. We have an example, a real example in our community here in Santa Clara County. Our city of San Jose has been a champion in reimagining and transforming the way that we shelter people. So the city of San Jose has a huge congregate shelter, but quickly during COVID, they figured out this is not working. We have to somehow find an innovative way to house people. And they came up with what we call now emergency interim housing sites. We so far, I think, have 500 beds, and we just opened another site yesterday. And the special thing about that site is the city of San Jose from 2 years ago invited people with lived experience to not only design out the landscape, pick the colors of the buildings, and then also sit on the RFP panel to select the provider. And then for the last maybe 6 months, we have been working together with the provider that was selected to run the sites, working on things like community guidelines, making sure that community guidelines are very housing first based, right? And now, after the opening ceremony yesterday, we're going to continue to become involved because we want to see peer support programs, right, be implemented in places like this. So I'll stop there. I took too much time. Thank you, Matthew.
Great. Shaundell, anything you want to add on this before we move on?
I just really quickly, Claudine really touched base on a lot of important things. And I think that not only trying new things, but putting things that make sense that might not make so much sense to many. So training, funding, resources, connections with other partners that are not exactly in the homeless realm, but are needed for services such as senior services, mental health providers, workforce development providers, adult education, medical professionals, DV providers, youth and young adult providers, law enforcement, key partnerships that are needed to support people that are experiencing homelessness along their journey that will follow them into either permanent supportive housing or permanent housing, as I stated before. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the two action areas that we've delved into most deeply, 1 and 2, are really foundational for change. So we're going to do a very quick review, and I'm going to encourage myself and Shaundell and Claudine to be very quick on the next couple of slides, because we want to make sure we hold about 15 minutes for the questions and answers. So now is also a good time to put other questions. There's some good questions queuing up in there already, but if you do have other burning questions, put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So we're going to walk through 3, 4, 5, and 6 and try to get through that in the next couple of minutes. So Shaundell, I'm going to turn to you next. On the next slide, please.
Thank you. Action area 3 is where you dive into assessing successes and areas for improvement in achievement of identified values and standards within programs. You'll want to be looking at both existing programs and any new programs that you may have added under action area 2, and see how close they are going to be to being able to achieve the values and standards your community identified in the first stage of your work. Some of the key objectives you'd want to pursue in this action area might include, again, consistently assessing and identifying opportunities to strengthen, identifying and supporting existing interim housing programs with greatest potential for transitioning into new or improved models, educating public and private funders regarding opportunities to better align funding within the achievement of communities' values and standards. What you find and learn under this action area will directly inform your efforts under the next action area. Next slide, please. Action area 4 is where you deploy capacity building and quality improvement efforts. You'll especially want to focus on addressing the capacity of organizations and programs to achieve the values and standards that your community has identified, with an approach that is not about blaming programs, because we don't want to do that, but rather recognizes that they likely have not had access to resources and supports they've needed. You'll especially want to focus on addressing concerns and recommendations that people with lived experience have prioritized. And as you can see, the objectives are here. You can visit the document to further your knowledge. Next slide.
Oh, this is my slide. All right, so action area 5 in aligning interim housing programs within systemic efforts to end homelessness. I'm not going to read through the bullet points that are on here, but this is so important, right? So whatever you recreate, reimagine, transform as far as interim housing, it must be integrated into what you already have. So earlier, I sort of alluded to our here in Santa Clara County, our community plan to end homelessness. Interim housing sites that are being erected and are already in place, they don't exist outside of the supportive housing system, right? So you have to figure out, where does this fall, right? At what stage of your process would your interim housing programs fall into? And then also, there's going to be a need to look at, well, what should you advocate for? Right, so to strengthen this new model, or maybe a new and improved model that you are working on, what do you advocate for that is going to change the minds of maybe some of your elected officials that are completely against some of these solutions that will end homelessness? And also look at your system capacity. Do you need to build more system capacity? And what kinds of strategic action plans do you create to carry that out? And definitely look at the gaps. How do you fill the gaps that exist in your system? And maybe interim housing programs is one of those gap fillers. Thank you, Matthew. Next slide.
Great, thank you. And then the third stage is around iteration and strengthening your transformation efforts and increasing momentum, and with the idea that you likely are going to be cycling through these stages in these action areas multiple times and trying to get better and generating maybe new investments that support the vision that you've identified, and over time getting to true transformation. And some of the key things here are just really focusing on the importance of truthfulness and transparency about what you're learning, what you're trying, and what you're moving away from, and trying to identify those models that are demonstrating the greatest promise, and finding ways to shore up those models and support their continued success. And then over time, starting to shift away from models that aren't able to or are unwilling to pursue the kinds of values and standards that you're identifying. That's not your first step, but over time, you may need to recognize that your community does need to invest in the programs that are showing the greatest promise and the most dedicated to the vision and values that you've identified. Next slide, please. Those quick next steps. The webinar will be posted on the framework website as soon as possible. We're going to start in the next month or so trying to bring some communities who are pursuing this work into some virtual roundtable discussions to generate community and momentum among those communities, but also to generate ideas and learnings that we can share more broadly. If there feels like there's interest, we might schedule some office hours where people can just drop in to wrestle with some of these ideas. And we'll be looking for opportunities to present at conferences. And then with the idea that hopefully over the balance of the next 6 months or longer, we'll be learning new things, we'll be generating new ideas, and maybe we'll be able to add to the materials we've generated so far. And then in 2024, we're hoping to be able to dive deeply into 1 or 2 communities and provide more hands-on support. I I don't think we have everybody's email anywhere in the presentation, but you can use my email to reach any of the folks that you've heard from today. I'll be happy to forward messages along if Shaundell or Claudine said something that you want to follow up on. Rashema got pulled out onto something else at the last minute, but you can reach her as well. But feel free to use my mailbox to get to any of us. And then we have about 12 minutes where we're going to try to wrestle with some of the questions that have come in so far. And I know we're not going to get to all of them, so I apologize in advance, and we might look for some opportunities to try to answer some of them offline afterwards. So there's a couple of questions that had come in that I wanted to turn to that are a little bit different than anything we've wrestled with so far. One question has to do with the engaging of elected officials and community leaders, and when might that be most successful in engaging them into this process and how to do that well. So while Claudine and Shaundell think about that question, I'm going to offer up, I think part of the value of this approach and this process is that bringing people in early allows you to understand their perspectives and understand what they are going to be looking for, and you can better position what it is you end up with to align with what's going to resonate with elected officials or other leaders. But one thing I also hear all the time from elected officials is that they hear so many different ideas and opinions that they don't know which is the one that they're supposed to follow, and they often follow the loudest voices or the squeakiest wheels. And I think this approach offers you the opportunity to have a shared vision and to be consistently expressing the same ideas and the same needs, so that people hear it as a community perspective rather than a set of competing perspectives. And so I do think there's a way that this can be beneficial in engaging elected officials and other leaders into your work by getting to that shared ideas, shared perspectives, and shared values on the front end. But Shaundell or Claudine, any thoughts you want to offer on this one?
Yes, yes, Matthew. So I think if your elected officials don't already know about the stress and the burden on your communities right now in addressing homelessness, then they either have their head in the sand or they're pretending, right? There's no way that elected officials are just sitting in their offices and making speeches and attending meetings, council meetings, without knowing what's going on, right? It's very visible. Homelessness is very visible, especially in the bigger cities. So I think if you haven't already involved them, oh my goodness, get them involved now. Like figure out the schedules for your council meetings or your board of supervisor meetings for your counties, and be there and show up and speak up, right? So I think the other thing too with this is data. Data, sometimes we look at it as a dirty word, but data is amazing if you add the narratives of the people being affected by homelessness and use that data to your full advantage. You proactively promote that data and make create hyperboles, right, that show what interim housing solutions can do to bring some of that data down, to show exits out of homelessness into some type of temporary housing or even permanent housing, to show that things are moving. There's a flow that's happening. And then also I think too, like share whatever lessons that you're learning. If you are the COC or a nonprofit organization, whatever organization you operate, share the lessons that you've learned, including the failures and the challenges, right? Because that's where you identify gaps, and that's where you present an opportunity to those elected officials and even people with money and power to look at it and go, oh, I can fill that gap, right? But it requires always communicating all of these things, the difficulties and also the victories in the work that you're engaged in. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to add on to what Claudine was saying, thank you, Claudine. I can be loud. I'm super loud, and I'm involved in a lot of things. So the more things that you're involved in, the more that you're promoting, right? Flyers, community conversations, especially in our area in Western Mass, we have something called the Western Mass Network to End Homelessness, and they're really involved with being that communication for lobbying and doing everything that we need to get done with our representatives. And we are so grateful and fortunate to have our representatives really be involved in ending homelessness in Western Massachusetts. So just again, being loud and being, I don't want to say it, but being loud and being proud, right? That's what you need to do. And again, making it a community conversation, because the more members of the community that you get involved, whether they're agency partners, again, partners within the school system, partners around, everybody that's affected by homelessness, that's who they're gonna get the response of the people that we need to get the response from and the attention from.
Great. We have another tough question here. Most of the questions in the Q&A are pretty tough questions. But any strategies or advice you could offer for trying to move this work forward in a community where the COC hasn't historically been very collaborative, or the agencies have not worked together typically very closely? Just do you have thoughts about what can help create change or shift around that culture?
Yes, Matthew, as you were asking that question, I'm shaking my head because that's such a damper, right? When everyone in a community, starting especially with government, when everybody is not coming together and moving in the same direction in accomplishing this goal of preventing and ending homelessness, right? So in speaking specifically about what's going on in our county, we have something called collective impact. I spoke about it a little bit earlier, but collective impact is where you bring everyone together, agree on one thing, and that one and first thing can be housing first principles. If you can all agree on that part, on that philosophy of housing first, then you can begin to involve everyone, and it's a painful process, right? So collective impact also includes community members that are NIMBYs, community members that are strictly against any housing solutions for people experiencing homelessness. It also includes people that are currently experiencing homelessness. They are part of the community, even if they don't have houses over their heads, right? So convene everyone together. And that's for whoever answered that question, I put my email in the chat. Send me an email and I would love to send you some resources about what has worked in our county and what continues to work. So when I said earlier about contributing to the problem, or contributing to creating consensus from all these different stakeholders, it really helps to proactively share the struggle, share the challenges, and share the lessons that you're learning, and put people with experience of homelessness who have experienced some success in front of whomever is not being a team player in that collective impact model, right? So when humans hear from other humans that have climbed through a hole of struggles and difficulties in homelessness, and then they see the person that they are now after having moved through that journey, it moves a person's heart, right? And I feel like that's the hope that we have, is that you're dealing with humans, and humans we like to think of as having hearts of flesh and not hearts of stone. So I hope that helps you.
Shaundell, I know you come from a very collaborative community, but any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, it kind of angers me, right, to hear that there might be a COC that isn't as community-based as we strive to be, right? Because in our COC, which is the Tri-County COC, we cover, again, much of the Western Mass counties. There's 4, right? In partnership with the 4th, which is Hampden County. We cover Franklin, Berkshire, and Hampshire counties. And the services and the vision of ending homelessness and the want and the need to end homelessness is just, our partnerships are as good as we're gonna get, right? That is, our partnerships is our bread and butter. And I'm not putting it in that sense because of monetary wise, I'm putting it in the sense because our community is who we are. And if we're not living up to that expectation, then maybe communicating with a HUD representative or a technical assistance provider that can maybe bridge that relationship and say, hey, you got to do better. That's kind of angers me again, but that's what I got. Thanks.
Yep, and I'll just offer the thought that I think in that kind of a community, you might have to spend a lot of time in the first action area, the first stage in the action area around initiating and building the allies and generating the voices, and over time, becoming an irresistible force in which other folks have to start to come along with the vision that you're carving out. And I know that's not an easy path, but really thinking, as I think Claudine especially emphasized, what's the way you can bring the voices of people who lived experience and expertise into that and help create that momentum and that irresistible force for change. But knowing that you might have to spend a long time in that stage in order to bring folks willing to start to have the dialogues and the conversations you need to have. We are coming up right at the end of our time, and I know folks have incredibly busy schedules, so I don't want to hold people longer. So we are going to wrap up with the apology that there are questions in the Q&A box that we are not going to get to. We'll look at them as a team afterwards, see if there's some that we can help answer offline, or encourage folks to reach out, and we can try to engage in some dialogue with communities around some of these issues as well. Absolutely see the questions that are coming up about funding and money, and we know we have not solved for that in this project to date. I do think there's, in some communities, depends on the community, some communities, the initiation of this work is a great opportunity for philanthropic resources to fund the conversations, to fund the convening of people, to fund staff who can play these roles of bringing the dialogues together. But philanthropy will not solve for the fundamental transformations and the ongoing operations and services that are going to be needed. So we absolutely know that this is not something that we have a way to tell you where to turn to get the money and start this transformation. But again, just hoping we're laying out a vision that's helping people think through how to stage it, how to start to pursue it. And over time, we're hoping that more momentum will happen, and sometimes momentum attracts resources. Any final thoughts, Shaundell or Claudine, before we let people get back to their busy days?
I think that, oh, go ahead, Claudine.
Oh, thank you. I want to thank each and every one of you for the work that you're doing and the lives of the people that you are touching day in and day out. I think it's such hard work. It's burdensome, and it's work that I'm so passionate about, and it's the reason I'm emotional about it. And I just encourage each of you to take care of yourselves too, right? So that's so important, because if not for you, then who helps the people in your community? So thank you again for shaving off an hour and a half of your time to spend with us. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to equal Claudine's sentiments, and just get the work done and start somewhere, anywhere, but start. Thanks.
Thank you both. And again, thank you everyone for spending time on this. I appreciate the words of encouragement in the chat box. So we feel like we are starting down a path that we hope will start to create the change we need. Next slide has my email address on it. Do feel free to reach out. I can connect you to anybody on the team, and look for more opportunities to be engaged in these kinds of dialogues in the future. Thank you so much.